Weddings were supposed to be predictable, flowers arranged just right, vows rehearsed in trembling voices, and love sealed in a way everyone understood. But on that warm evening, something entirely unplanned slipped quietly into Lila Carter's life, disguised as a single fleeting moment. Lila had spent months perfecting her sister Sophie's wedding. Every ribbon, every light, every carefully placed rose carried her signature touch. Yet as the music softened and laughter filled the air, she found herself stepping away from the crowd, seeking a breath of stillness in the quiet corridor just beyond the reception hall. It was there she saw him. He stood alone, composed and distant, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the dim light around him. To Lila, in that fragile, emotional haze of the evening, he looked familiar, like someone she had been expecting, someone tied to the swirl of emotions she hadn't had time to process. Without overthinking, without pausing to question herself, she walked up to him. And then she kissed him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't planned. It was soft, brief, and filled with a strange sincerity that neither of them could explain. For a heartbeat, time seemed to fold in on itself. The noise of the wedding faded, leaving only the quiet awareness of two strangers sharing something unexpectedly real. When Lila pulled away, reality rushed back in. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened. This wasn't who she thought it was. Murmuring a quick apology, she turned and hurried away before he could say a word, her heart racing with embarrassment and confusion. She didn't look back. But he did. Adrian Volkov remained exactly where she left him, his expression unreadable, his thoughts unusually unsettled. In a life defined by control and calculated decisions, nothing had ever caught him so off guard. And yet, that single accidental kiss lingered. Not as a mistake, but as the beginning of something neither of them saw coming. The morning after the wedding arrived too quickly, carrying with it a lingering sense of unease that Lila Carter couldn't shake. What had felt like a fleeting, embarrassing mistake the night before now sat heavily in her thoughts, replaying in fragments she wished she could erase. She tried to bury herself in work, clearing decorations, returning rentals, and finalizing payments. But no matter how busy she kept her hands, her mind wandered back to that quiet corridor, and to him. It wasn't just the kiss. It was the way he hadn't reacted. No confusion, no anger. Just stillness. As if he had understood something she didn't. By midday, whispers began to circulate among the remaining guests and vendors. Names were mentioned in hushed tones, conversations abruptly cut off when Lila walked by. At first she ignored it. Weddings always came with gossip. Until she heard his name. Adrian Volkov. The way it was spoken made her pause. Not casually. Not lightly. But carefully, like it carried weight. Curiosity got the better of her. She asked one of the caterers, expecting a simple answer. Instead, she received a cautious glance and a warning she hadn't expected. "He's not someone you want to cross paths with," the woman said quietly. A chill ran through Lila. The realization hit her slowly, piece by piece. The man she had approached so freely, the stranger she had kissed without hesitation. He wasn't just another guest. He was someone powerful. Someone dangerous by reputation if nothing else. Her stomach tightened. Panic crept in, not loud or overwhelming but steady and persistent. What if he had taken offense? What if her impulsive action had consequences she couldn't predict? Across the city, Adrian sat in his office, the memory of the kiss just as vivid. "Find her," he said simply to Marcus Hale, his voice calm but firm. Marcus didn't question him, though his expression hinted at concern. Adrian rarely showed interest in anything outside his world. But this was different. Because for the first time in a long while, Adrian wasn't driven by control or obligation. He was driven by curiosity. And somewhere between Lila's growing fear and Adrian's quiet pursuit, the distance between them began to close, pulling them both toward a path neither fully understood. By the third day, Lila Carter had almost convinced herself that the moment would fade into nothing more than an awkward memory. No calls came. No consequences followed. Life, on the surface, continued as it always had. That was exactly why she wasn't prepared when he walked in. The soft chime of the office door barely registered at first. Lila was bent over her desk, reviewing event notes, when the atmosphere in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Conversations near the entrance quieted. Movement slowed. And then she looked up. Adrian Volkov stood just inside the doorway, composed as ever, his presence drawing attention without effort. He didn't appear rushed or impatient. Instead, he carried himself with calm precision, as though he belonged exactly where he was. Lila's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, gathering what composure she could, she stood and approached him, her heart beating faster with every step. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "I believe you can," Adrian replied, his tone even. "I'm looking to organize an event." The words were simple, almost ordinary, but there was something deliberate in them. Lila nodded, gesturing toward a seating area, slipping into professional mode as a shield against her nerves. As they sat, she kept her focus on paperwork, on schedules, on anything that felt familiar. But his gaze remained steady, not intrusive, just present. Finally he spoke again. "You left rather quickly the other night." The air between them shifted. Lila hesitated, then allowed herself a small, embarrassed smile. "I realized I made a mistake." Adrian studied her for a moment before responding, his voice softer than before. It didn't feel like one. The honesty of his words caught her off guard. There was no accusation. No edge. Just quiet sincerity. For reasons she couldn't explain, the tension in her chest eased, just slightly. What she didn't realize was that this visit wasn't about an event. It was about understanding why that one unexpected moment had stayed with him, and why, despite everything she had heard, she didn't feel the fear she thought she would. What began as a single visit did not end there. In the days that followed, Adrian Volkov found quiet, reasonable excuses to return. A question about venue options. A change in guest arrangements. A brief discussion about timing. Each visit was short, controlled, and outwardly professional. But beneath that surface, something subtle was unfolding. Lila noticed it first in the way their conversation stretched just a little longer each time. What started as formal exchanges slowly softened into something more natural. Adrian asked questions, not intrusive ones but thoughtful ones. About her work. About how she managed pressure. About what she enjoyed when she wasn't planning weddings. It was unexpected. And strangely disarming. Lila had prepared herself to deal with someone cold, distant, maybe even intimidating. Instead, she found glimpses of someone else entirely. Someone observant. Someone who listened more than he spoke. Someone who, despite the quiet authority he carried, didn't try to dominate the space around him. Still, she didn't forget what she had heard. There was a world behind Adrian. A world she didn't understand and wasn't sure she wanted to. That knowledge lingered at the edges of every interaction. A quiet reminder that this connection came with risks she couldn't fully see. Adrian, on the other hand, was experiencing something unfamiliar. Lila didn't treat him with caution or expectation. She didn't ask about his power or his reputation. When she spoke to him, it was simple. Honest. Unfiltered. And in those moments, he wasn't defined by anything other than who he chose to be. That alone made him return. One evening, after the office had emptied and the city outside softened into twilight, their conversation slowed into a comfortable silence. Neither rushed to fill it. Lila glanced at him, unsure why leaving suddenly felt difficult. "I should go," she said quietly. Adrian nodded but didn't move. For a brief second, hesitation lingered between them, unspoken but understood. Then, without fully thinking, Lila stepped forward. The hug was gentle. Brief. And yet, it carried more meaning than either expected. When they pulled apart, nothing was said. But something had changed. Because what stood between them now wasn't just curiosity. It was connection, and the quiet realization that crossing this line might not be easy to undo. By now, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Adrian's visits had become a quiet rhythm in Lila's life, unannounced, yet somehow expected. And with every passing day, the distance she once tried to maintain grew thinner, replaced by something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. But not everyone saw it the same way. Marcus Hale noticed the change long before Adrian acknowledged it. He had watched from a distance, observing the subtle shifts, the longer absences, the rare distraction in Adrian's focus, the unspoken weight behind decisions that once came effortlessly. One evening, as the city settled into darkness, Marcus finally spoke. "This isn't like you," he said, his tone calm but firm. Adrian didn't respond immediately. "She doesn't belong in this world," Marcus continued. "And the closer she gets, the more complicated things become." There was no threat in his words, only truth. Adrian knew it. Across town, Lila sat alone in her apartment, replaying the same thoughts. What started as coincidence had turned into something real, something steady and undeniable. Yet every step forward came with a quiet question she couldn't ignore. Where does this lead? She knew enough to understand that Adrian's life was not simple. It wasn't something she could step into without consequences. And still, when she was with him, those concerns seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of calm she hadn't expected. The next time they met, neither pretended things were the same. Their conversation was softer, more careful, as if both were aware of the line they were approaching. When silence settled between them again, it felt heavier than before. Lila hesitated, then stepped closer. This time the hug lasted longer. Not out of impulse but choice. Adrian didn't pull away. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. No expectations, no warnings, no consequences waiting in the distance. Just stillness. But even in that quiet, both of them understood something important. Some connections don't ask for permission. And the deeper they go, the harder they are to walk away from. Some truths don't arrive all at once. They reveal themselves in fragments, in moments that don't quite make sense until they do. For Lila, it happened on an ordinary evening that turned unexpectedly heavy. She hadn't planned to see Adrian that day. In fact, she had decided to create distance, to give herself space to think clearly. But as fate would have it, their paths crossed outside her office just as she was closing up. "You seem different." Not distant, but focused in a way she hadn't seen before. There was a tension in his posture, subtle yet unmistakable. And for the first time since she had met him, Lila felt like she was standing on the edge of something she didn't fully understand. "I need to take care of something," Adrian said, his voice steady. She nodded, but something held her there. Curiosity, concern, something deeper. Without thinking, she lingered nearby longer than she should have. That was when she saw it. A conversation, quiet but intense, between Adrian and a group of men who carried themselves with the same controlled authority. Their words were low, but their tone spoke clearly enough. This wasn't business in the way Lila understood it. This was something else. Something serious. Something dangerous. The realization settled in her chest, heavy and undeniable. Later that night, when Adrian returned, she didn't avoid it. "Tell me the truth," Lila said, her voice calm but firm. "All of it." Adrian didn't deflect. He didn't soften it or dress it in easier words. Instead, he told her exactly who he was. Not in detail, not with explanations meant to justify, but with honesty. He spoke of responsibility, of power, of a life shaped by choices that couldn't easily be undone. When he finished, silence filled the space between them. Lila felt the weight of it, the reality she had sensed but never fully faced. "I needed to hear it from you," she said quietly. Adrian nodded, his expression unchanged, though something in his eyes softened. "I won't ask you to understand it," he said. "And I won't ask you to stay." There was no pressure. No expectation. Just truth. And standing there, Lila realized something even more difficult than fear. She didn't see him differently. But now she had to decide what that meant. Knowing the truth changed everything, and yet it didn't. Lila had spent the entire night replaying Adrian's words, turning them over in her mind as if understanding them from different angles might make the decision easier. But clarity didn't come. Only a quiet, steady weight settled in her chest. By morning she knew what she had to do. Not because she wanted to, but because she believed it was the only way to protect herself from something that could grow beyond her control. When Adrian arrived later that day, he didn't seem surprised to find her waiting. There was no tension in his posture, no urgency in his steps. If anything, he looked prepared, like a man who had already accepted an outcome he hadn't yet heard. "I can't do this," Lila said before hesitation could stop her. The words felt heavier once they were spoken, but she didn't take them back. Adrian studied her quietly, his expression unreadable. "It's not about how I feel," she continued, her voice softer now. "It's everything around you, your world. I don't belong in it." There it was, the truth she couldn't ignore. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled with everything neither of them said. Adrian gave a small nod. "I understand." No argument. No attempt to change her mind. That somehow made it harder. Lila felt something tighten in her chest. Part of her had expected resistance, something that would make leaving easier. But Adrian offered none of it. He simply accepted her choice, even if it meant losing something he hadn't expected to find. "I never wanted you to be part of that world," he added quietly. "I know," she replied. And she did. That was what made this so difficult. Their final moment was simple. No dramatic farewell. No promises they couldn't keep. Just a quiet pause, and then a brief, lingering hug. When they stepped apart, the distance between them felt different, final in a way neither could deny. Lila walked away first this time, and Adrian led her. But as the days passed, something became clear to both of them. Walking away didn't erase what had already begun. It only made the absence louder. Life moved forward as it always did, but for Lila, it felt quieter, like something important had slipped out of reach and left an empty space behind. She returned to her routines, taking on new clients, planning events, and filling her days with the kind of structure she had always relied on. From the outside nothing had changed, but inside everything had. There were moments, small, unexpected ones, when she would pause, remembering the calm she felt around Adrian, the way conversations never felt forced, the way silence between them had never been uncomfortable. And then she would remind herself why she walked away. It was safer. It was necessary. At least that's what she kept telling herself. One evening, after finishing a late consultation, Lila stepped out onto a quiet street, the city unusually still around her. She didn't notice the shift at first, the subtle feeling that something wasn't right. Until it was. A tense exchange nearby, voices low but sharp, drew her attention. She froze, unsure whether to move closer or walk away. Before she could decide, the situation escalated just enough to make her uneasy. And then just as quickly it ended. Not by chance. By Adrian. He stepped into the scene with the same quiet authority she had seen before, his presence alone enough to dissolve the tension. No raised voice. No unnecessary force. Just control. Lila watched from a distance, her heart racing, not from fear of him but from the realization of how easily he had stepped in. He hadn't seen her. Or if he had, he didn't show it. Once everything settled, Adrian left without looking back, as if his only purpose had been to ensure nothing happened to her. And that was when it became clear. He hadn't tried to pull her back into his life. He hadn't crossed the boundary she set. But he hadn't stopped caring either. Standing there, Lila felt the weight of her decision shift. Because for the first time she understood something important. What she felt for Adrian wasn't built on pressure or fear. It was built on choice. And now, the choice was hers to make again. Some decisions don't come from sudden realization. They grow quietly, shaped by everything that refuses to fade. For Lila, the answer had been forming long before she allowed herself to say it out loud. She found Adrian the next day. Not by coincidence, not by accident, but intentionally, with a steady resolve she hadn't felt before. When she stepped into the space he occupied, he looked up immediately, as if part of him had expected this moment. Neither of them spoke at first. There was no need for rushed explanations or rehearsed words. The silence between them wasn't uncertain, it was full of everything they already understood. "I've been trying to convince myself I made the right choice," Lila finally said. Adrian didn't interrupt. "But it never felt complete," she continued. "Because it wasn't honest. That was what mattered most. Not fear. Not assumptions. Just truth." Adrian studied her carefully, not searching for weakness but for certainty. And he found it. "I don't want to walk away because I'm afraid," Lila said. "But I also won't lose who I am trying to fit into something that isn't mine." Her voice didn't shake. It was clear. Grounded. A choice, not a reaction. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant. "I would never ask you to," he replied. "And I won't build something with you that takes that away." There was no grand promise. No unrealistic declarations. Just a simple, powerful agreement. They would move forward, but not at the cost of themselves. Lila stepped closer, closing the space that had once felt impossible to cross. This time there was no hesitation. When she embraced him, it wasn't brief or uncertain. It was steady. Intentional. Adrian held her just as firmly, not as someone trying to keep her, but as someone choosing to stand beside her. No pressure. No chains. Just two people meeting each other as they truly were. And in that moment, what they shared felt stronger than anything built on control. Because this time, they weren't holding on out of fear of losing each other. They were holding on because they chose to stay. It didn't happen all at once. Forever rarely does. For Adrian Volkov and Lila Carter, what came next wasn't a dramatic shift or a sudden escape from everything that once defined them. It was quieter than that. More intentional. Built slowly in choices repeated over time. Adrian didn't leave his world behind overnight. And Lila didn't abandon hers. Instead, they found a fragile balance. One that required patience, honesty, and boundaries neither of them ignored. There were still challenges. Still distance at times. Still reminders of how different their lives had once been. But something had changed. They no longer met in fragments of uncertainty. They met in understanding. Months later, at a wedding unlike the first one that brought them together, Lila stood near the entrance, watching guests fill the space with laughter and movement. Everything looked familiar, yet different. Not because the setting had changed but because she had. Adrian approached quietly, standing beside her without announcing himself. That had become his way, no unnecessary noise, no dominance of space. Just presence. You're thinking about it, he said softly. Lila smiled faintly. About the first time we met? He didn't deny it. The memory lingered between them, the mistake, the confusion, the moment that should have meant nothing, and instead became everything. I still can't believe that's how it started, she said. Adrian glanced at her. Sometimes the smallest moments change everything. Silence followed, but it was comfortable now. Familiar. Without needing words, Lila stepped closer. The hug they shared was different from all the others. No uncertainty. No hesitation. Just warmth built from everything they had been through together. Not an escape. Not a fantasy. Just two people choosing each other again and again. As the celebration continued around them, Adrian spoke quietly, almost like a promise carried by time rather than words. That moment changed my life. Lila leaned slightly against him. It changed mine too. And for the first time, neither of them wondered what came next. Because forever wasn't something they were chasing anymore. It was something they were already living. One moment, one choice, one quiet beginning at a time.